I've been doing this job for about 14 months now, and I still don't fully know how to describe it to people when they ask. The short version is dead mail. I work for a regional mail recovery unit, not a post office exactly, more like the place mail goes when it has nowhere else to go. Undeliverable parcels, letters with no return address, packages where the recipient moved and didn't leave a forwarding, items that came through the system, mangled enough that the address label is gone entirely. When regular carriers exhaust their options, the item gets flagged and routed to us. We log it, we try to trace it, and if we can't trace it within the hold window, we either auction it, donate it, or in some cases open it to look for identifying information inside. That last part is what most people don't know about. You're legally allowed to open undeliverable mail under specific circumstances. There's paperwork. There's a procedure. It's more formal than it sounds, but it's also more ordinary than people imagine. Most of what's inside is just stuff. Clothing ordered online, kitchen gadgets, books people probably forgot they ordered, sometimes handwritten letters, which are harder to deal with because even if you can't identify the sender, you've still read something private. I try not to think about that part too much. I took the job because it was there. That sounds bleak, but I mean it practically. I'd spent the previous 3 years doing inventory management for a small appliance wholesaler that went under during a stretch of bad contracts and worse luck. Nothing dramatic, just the slow kind of collapse where one day you're filing purchase orders and the next day, HR calls you into a room with a plant in it and a woman you've never met before. They gave me 6 weeks of severance. I made it last almost 4 months, which I was proud of at the time. The mail recovery job paid less than I'd been making, but it came with full benefits, and the shifts were predictable, which mattered more to me than I wanted to admit. I'd been engaged the year before briefly, and then not. And the inventory job going under at the same time as everything else left me in a financial and personal position that I'd spent most of a year trying to stop thinking about. The stability of knowing exactly when I'd be at a desk and exactly when I'd leave that was worth more than the salary difference. The facility is a converted warehouse on the outer edge of an industrial complex about 40 minutes from where I live. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. Brown metal cladding, a loading dock with a cracked apron, a parking lot that floods in heavy rain because the drainage was designed for a building half its current footprint. Inside, it's divided into 3 main sections: intake, processing, and what everyone calls the back room, which is where items go when their hold period starts. My workstation is in processing. 4 long folding tables under fluorescent lights, a shared computer terminal at each end, and a cart system that runs items in from intake. There are 6 of us on my shift, though we rarely all work the same days. The work is mostly quiet. You scan an item, check the label against the routing database, try a few recovery steps, and either advance it toward resolution or move it to the hold shelf. Some days, I process 40 packages. Some days closer to 100, depending on what's backed up. There's a guy named Terrence who works the table across from mine and talks too much, but not in an annoying way. More like he fills the silence with running commentary that you can tune in and out of freely. His wife just had their 2nd kid, and he shows me photos on his phone at least twice a week. I don't mind. I want to be specific about the kind of work it is before I get into anything else. It's the kind of job where your hands know what to do before your brain does. Scan, check, log, advance, repeat. After a few weeks, you stop reading labels consciously and just process them. It has a rhythm that isn't exactly comfortable, but is consistent. And after the year I'd had, consistent was what I needed. The first thing I noticed that didn't fit was a package, roughly 7 weeks into the job. It came through on a Tuesday or Wednesday. I keep saying Tuesday, but I honestly can't verify that. It was mid-morning, low-volume day. Maybe 20 items on the cart when I got in. Standard-looking parcel, brown cardboard, medium-sized, the kind of box a book or a small electronic might come in. The shipping label was intact, but unreadable, not damaged exactly. More like it had been printed on a laser printer that was running low on toner, so the text had this faded, slightly ghosted look, where the barcode scanned fine, but the human-readable address line was just pale gray smudging. I scanned it. The system returned no match, which meant the barcode didn't correspond to any active tracking number in the regional database. That happens more than people think. Parcels that were shipped through a third-party carrier and then handed off improperly, or items that come in from overseas through informal channels. I logged it as unmatched, filled in the intake notes, and put it on the hold shelf. Normal procedure. What I noticed, and I almost didn't notice, was that the box had already been opened. Not torn open, not damaged. The top flaps had been cleanly separated, then resealed with a strip of tape that was slightly different in color from the original packing tape. Slightly warmer in tone, like it had come from a different roll. The seam was neat. You'd only catch it if you were handling the item closely, and I was, because I was checking whether the label edges were concealing any additional information underneath. I looked inside, just packing material, those paper accordion sheets, and at the bottom, wrapped loosely, a ceramic mug. No note, no packing slip, nothing with a name on it. The mug was plain white except for a small, screen-printed image on one side, the kind of thing you'd order from a custom print website. Just a stock landscape. Mountains. I logged the contents, resealed it with a fresh strip of our standard tape, and put it back on the hold shelf. I noted in the intake record that the item appeared to have been previously opened. That's all there was to it. I didn't think about it again. That should tell you something about the job. A package that's already been opened doesn't register as strange in this environment. It registers as one more box in an imperfect system. You note it, you move on. The system processes thousands of items a month across the region, and by the time something reaches us, it's passed through enough hands that almost anything is possible. I'm telling you this because I want to be honest about why I didn't ask more questions early on. It wasn't carelessness. It was context. In that building, in that job, the anomaly was small enough to disappear into the background noise of a system that generates anomalies constantly. About 10 days later, a second item came through. Different size, different shape. A flat envelope, the padded kind, bubble lining inside. Label was complete and readable, but when I ran it through the system, the address didn't exist. Not invalid, not mistyped. The street just didn't exist anywhere in our routing database, which covers a wide region. The sender address in the return corner was a P.O. box number with no associated city or postal code, which is either a printing error or someone who genuinely doesn't know how to fill out a shipping label. I opened it. Procedure-padded envelopes with unresolvable addresses go to inspection before hold, because small flat items have a higher incidence of certain things I won't get into. Inside was a photograph, printed on standard photo paper, the glossy kind, shot from above and at an angle, looking down at a person standing at a table. The person was processing mail. You could see their hands on a package, see the scan gun nearby, see a cart partially visible at the edge of frame. The lighting had the harsh, flat quality of fluorescent overheads. I stared at it for a while. Then I put it on the table and looked at the back. Blank. No writing, no date, no studio stamp. It was a photograph of someone at a processing table that looked exactly like mine. I say looked like mine because the details weren't quite right, or I thought they weren't at the time. The scan gun in the photo was the older model, the one with the rubber grip that's cracked on the left side. Our facility had switched to the newer model a few months before I started, but we kept 2 of the old ones in the drawer under the terminal because one of the newer ones kept dropping the Bluetooth connection. I used the old grip model sometimes, the cracked one. I stood there deciding whether to say something to someone, and I didn't. That's probably the decision I'd change if I could, but I don't know that it would have made a difference. What would I have said? There's a photograph in this envelope of someone who might be me. The person in the photo was shot from behind and above. You couldn't see their face. I couldn't even be completely certain it was me. The body position, the height, the way the hands were placed on the package. It looked like me, the way your reflection in a store window looks like you. Plausibly, you. Probably you. But without the face, there's nothing definitive. I logged the envelope as containing 1 photograph, contents unidentifiable, and advanced it to hold. I noted the non-existent return address. Standard procedure. That evening, I thought about it on the drive home. I reconstructed the image from memory and checked the details that seemed off. The cracked scan gun. The table surface ours has a strip of yellow safety tape along the left edge that someone added 2 years ago when a cart clipped a worker. In the photo, I couldn't remember seeing the yellow tape clearly. The image was shot at an angle that would have captured the left edge if you were positioned in the corner of the room near the intake door. We didn't have cameras in that corner as far as I knew. We had 2 overhead cameras, 1 at each end of the processing room. Standard security setup. I'd noticed them during my first week because they were the old dome kind, and one of them had a slightly cracked housing. I thought about the corner near the intake door. Then I thought, you're doing this because the day was boring and your brain needed something to work on. That's a real thing. I know myself well enough to know that I pattern match under stress, that I can construct significance from coincidence when I'm tired or anxious. And I'd been both intermittently since the whole previous year of my life. The photograph was probably from another facility. A demo image, a training photo, a random print someone had jammed into an envelope instead of a letter. I went home. I made dinner. I didn't mention it to anyone because there was no one in my apartment to mention it to. And that was a separate thing I didn't particularly want to examine. The next 3 weeks were normal, entirely normal. 40 to 100 items a day. Terrence talking about his kids. The fluorescent light over my table that buzzes slightly at a frequency that somehow only bothers you when you think about it. Normal. Then a package came through with my name on it. Not on the shipping label. The label was the same kind of incomplete, unreadable mess as the first one to toner fade. Ghosted text. Barcode scanning clean, but returning no match. It was my name inside, written on a small card tucked under the packing material. The kind of card that comes with flowers from a grocery store florist. Those tiny ones, half the size of a business card, pre-printed with a blank line for a message. My first name. Not my last. Just my first name, in handwriting that I can only describe as deliberate, not neat, not practiced, but slow. Like someone who doesn't write by hand often and was concentrating. I stood at the table for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. Terrence was on his phone at the far end. The 2 other people on shift were in the back room. The fluorescent buzz was doing its thing. Inside the package, under the packing material, was the ceramic mug. White, small, screen-printed mountain landscape on the side. Same mug. I recognized it because I'd handled it. When you handle an object in this job, you spend time with it. Checking it, logging it, deciding its fate. You don't forget what you've touched. And the tape on this box was our tape. The standard issue roll we keep at each table. The same warmer-toned strip that I'd used to reseal the first package was gone, replaced with ours. I checked the hold shelf. I checked twice. The first package, the one I'd processed 7 weeks ago and placed in hold, was not there. The hold shelf is organized by date received, clearly labeled. Items don't leave the hold shelf without being logged out. I checked the log. The mug package had no logged removal. It had just moved from hold, through some intermediate step I couldn't account for, to the intake cart, to my table. And it had acquired my name along the way. I didn't tell anyone that day either. I've thought about that a lot since. Not with the kind of self-recrimination where you catalog every wrong turn. I'm past that. But with genuine curiosity about what was happening in my head. The honest answer is that I was embarrassed. Telling my supervisor that a package came through the system addressed to me, containing a mug I'd already processed, felt like the setup to a conversation I didn't want to have. It would require me to explain that I found the first package unusual enough to remember, which would raise the question of why I hadn't flagged it then. And then the photograph would come up, because I'd have to be thorough. And then I'd be the new guy who'd been sitting on a chain of anomalies for almost 2 months and only spoke up when his name appeared on a card. So I logged it. I described the contents. I noted the card. Small enclosure with handwritten name of processing staff, first name only. And I advanced it to the hold shelf again. I even noted the discrepancy in the tape sealing, that the original warmer-toned strip had been replaced with our standard roll. I buried everything in the intake notes where it was technically documented and practically invisible. I put the card in my jacket pocket. That part wasn't procedure. I don't know exactly why I did it. Something about not wanting it processed out of existence before I'd had a chance to look at it again. At home that night, I put the card on my kitchen table and looked at it under better light. The handwriting wasn't anything I recognized. It wasn't particularly distinctive, no unusual letter forms, no lefty slant, nothing a handwriting analyst would write a paper about. Just someone's handwriting. Careful. The kind of careful that comes from infrequency rather than precision. I turned it over. The back was blank. The pre-printed flower shop formatting on the front. The little blank line for a message, my name occupied that line completely. Nothing above, nothing below. What got to me wasn't the name itself. It was the fact that only my first name was on it. If you were a stranger trying to address something to someone you'd looked up, you'd use their full name. Or at minimum, you'd err toward formality. My first name only suggested either that the sender knew me personally, or that they knew only enough to know what people at my workplace called me. At work, everyone uses first names. That's not unusual. But it narrowed the category of possible senders in a way that made the narrowing feel worse rather than better. I slept badly and went back in the next morning telling myself I'd talk to the supervisor. I didn't. The shift was busy. Terrence needed help with a backlog from the previous day, and by the time the pace slowed down, it was already afternoon, and the window for raising something serious had passed in the way those windows do, not with a decision, just with time. I started paying attention to the intake carts differently after that. Before, I'd pull items from the cart and process them in order, without much thought about sequence. The carts were loaded by the intake team at the start of shift, and you just worked through them. After the mug came back, I started looking at what came in. Not forensically, just noticing. Which items looked ordinary, which labels were fully readable, whether anything felt like it was being placed rather than routed. For 2 weeks, everything was normal. Then another photograph came through. Same delivery vector as the first padded envelope, unresolvable address, return corner with a P.O. box, and no location. I recognized the delivery type before I opened it. My hand slowed down. This photograph was different from the first one. Same overhead angle, same fluorescent quality, same processing table environment. But this one showed the table from a different position, from the direction of the exit door, which is at the opposite end of the room from the intake door. Whoever had taken the first photograph from one corner had now taken a photograph from the other corner. And in this one, the subject was facing slightly more toward the camera. Still not a full face. The head was angled down, looking at the table, but you could see more. The line of a jaw. Dark hair, short on the sides. A gray long-sleeve shirt with a small logo near the collar that I recognized as a brand. I owned several items from a regional outdoor gear company that sold at a particular discount store near where I used to live. I owned a gray shirt from that company. I wore it to work with some regularity because it was comfortable and didn't show dirt from the packages. I checked what I was wearing. Blue thermal, different entirely. So I couldn't say with absolute certainty that the shirt in the photograph was mine. But I could say that I owned one essentially identical, that I wore it to this building, and that the person in the photograph and I appeared to be the same height, same build, same hair. I looked up at the two security dome cameras. Both pointed inward from their respective ends of the room they were positioned to capture the full length of the tables, which was their purpose. A photograph taken from floor level near the exit door would require a camera or a person in a position that the official cameras didn't occupy. I looked at the corners more carefully than I had before. The ceiling junction where the exit wall met the side wall. Ductwork up there, which was normal. A conduit running along the top of the wall to a junction box, which was also normal. Nothing that resolved into a lens. That afternoon, I walked through the building on the way to the break room, taking a slightly different path than usual, through the intake area, around the back side of the hold shelving. I wasn't conducting a search exactly. I was just moving through a space I'd been in 100 times and letting myself see it as if I hadn't. The hold shelving is floor-to-ceiling wire rack units, about 12 feet high, organized by date tabs. Dense when full, which it usually is. I walked slowly along the back side where I never normally had reason to go. It was tighter back there, maybe 2 feet between the back of the shelving and the exterior wall, and it smelled differently. That damp, cold smell that old warehouse walls get in certain weather. The mug package wasn't on the hold shelf. I'd re-logged it and reshelved it myself 6 days earlier. I checked the log again on the terminal, still no logged removal. I went back to the shelf and checked the date section twice. Gone again. I stood in the break room with my coffee going cold and thought about the specific mechanics of how something leaves a shelf without being logged. The options were intake staff removing it without documentation, which would be a procedural violation, but not extraordinary. Someone from another shift, pulling it for review and forgetting to log it. Also a violation, but also ordinary in a system run by humans. Or the log was being updated in a way I wasn't seeing. I checked the digital log for the mug package's item number across all shift entries for the past week. The only entries were mine. It appeared once when I first processed it, and a second time when I re-logged it after it came back. No removal entry. No review entry. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't conclude from this. I didn't conclude that something impossible was happening. I concluded that I was looking at a documentation gap, which is real and common, inside of a larger pattern of anomalies, which was less easy to dismiss. The photographs, the reappearing package, the card with my name, each thing alone had a passable, ordinary explanation. Together, they were starting to describe something with a shape, and I didn't know what the shape was yet. I went back to the photograph. I'd kept it, same as the first one. Same reason not wanting it processed before I'd understood it. Both were now at my apartment, in the envelope I'd been keeping receipts in because I hadn't gotten around to setting up a proper filing system since I moved. Which tells you something about where my head was. I wasn't treating them as evidence exactly, more like problems I was going to get to when I had the bandwidth. That evening, I put them side by side on the kitchen table. I'd been thinking of them as two separate images, but looking at them together, I saw something I'd missed. The second photograph had something in the background that the first didn't. The first was shot from near the intake door. From that angle, the background of the image showed the far end of the processing room, the exit door, and the wall above it. Normal background. Nothing on that wall except the standard laminated safety notices and the clock. The second was shot from near the exit door. From that angle, the background showed the intake end of the room, the cart station, and the partial shape of the intake door leading to the corridor. In that background, visible but small because of the distance, there was a figure in the corridor, standing in the gap of the partially open intake door. Not moving, or at least not in motion at the moment the photograph was taken. Just standing, looking in. The image quality was what it was, a print from a consumer-grade photo printer, so the figure wasn't sharp. I couldn't describe their face or clothing in any useful way, but the posture was clear enough. Upright, still, oriented toward the room, toward me. I thought about the position. If you're the person taking a photograph from near the exit door, the figure in the intake corridor is behind the subject, behind the back of the person you're photographing, which meant there was a camera near the exit door capturing me at the table, and simultaneously, a person standing in the corridor at the intake end, possibly watching. Or, and I sat with this for a long time, there was only one person. The person in the corridor had set up a camera on some kind of remote trigger or timer near the exit door and was standing in the corridor watching the room while the camera captured it. That was the least alarming interpretation. It still required someone to have accessed my workplace, set up a recording device, and stood in a doorway watching me work. Which is not a low bar. I started thinking seriously about who. Not in the way where you spiral into paranoia and every acquaintance becomes a suspect. I mean, I sat down with a piece of paper and tried to be systematic about it. Who knew where I worked? Who would know my first name in a workplace context? Who would have the motivation and the access and the patience for something like this? The ex-engagement came up and I rejected it immediately. Not out of denial, but out of genuine incompatibility. This wasn't that shape of thing. What I'd lived through with Mara was ordinary human pain on both sides. Nothing with this kind of architecture. She'd moved to another city and, as far as I knew, had rebuilt her life in ways that didn't involve me. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. I thought about the inventory job, the people I'd worked with there, and came up equally empty. I'd had frictions and complications at that company like anyone does, but nothing that felt like it had left a live wire behind it. I thought about whether this could be something other than personal attest, some kind of internal audit, someone from management or compliance checking how staff handled irregularities. That version made the most organizational sense. It would explain the access, the institutional knowledge of procedures, the documentation gaps. But the photographs felt wrong for an audit. An internal compliance check doesn't photograph a specific employee from multiple angles over a period of weeks. I decided I needed to find out where the packages were coming from before they reached me. The intake process worked like this. Items arrived at the loading dock, were logged by the dock crew, sorted into carts by a small intake team, and then the carts were rolled into processing at the start of each shift. I worked processing. I'd never had a reason to spend time in intake, but there was nothing preventing me from being in intake. It wasn't a restricted area, and staff moved between sections occasionally for various reasons. The next morning I came in 15 minutes early, which I almost never did. I told myself I'd just look at the intake area, get a sense of how the carts were loaded, whether anyone could slip something into a cart between loading and processing. The intake room was smaller than I'd pictured from passing through it. Low ceilings, 2 receiving stations along the dock wall, a row of empty carts along the opposite wall. 2 intake workers I recognized by face but not by name, deep in a conversation about something on one of their phones. They glanced up when I came in, and one of them, the taller one, heavy-set, always wore a green zip-up, gave me the kind of nod that meant he registered my presence without caring about it. The dock door was closed. There were maybe 30 items staged on the receiving counters waiting to be sorted into the day's carts. I looked at them, walked past them slowly like I was looking for something specific, and came back the long way. Nothing jumped out. Everything staged looked like everything always looks. Labels, tape, the ordinary randomness of 1,000 different shippers and packagers. But I noticed that the carts from the previous day hadn't been fully cleared. There were still items on the bottom shelf of one cart, staged near the door to processing. Items that were going out this morning, waiting for the shift to start. One of them had the same faded toner label. I felt something tighten across my chest, not dramatically, just a physical fact. I reached for the item, which was a flat envelope, and the taller intake worker glanced over. I said, "This one's unreadable. I want to pull it now so I can start the trace early." He shrugged and looked back at his phone. I took it back to processing, which wasn't open yet. I sat down at my table alone in the empty room and turned the envelope over in my hands without opening it. On the back, where packing tape usually crossed the sealed edge, someone had written 4 words in the same slow, careful handwriting as my name on the card. "You're not finding these." I sat with that for a long time. The room was still empty. Terrence wasn't in yet. Nobody was. The fluorescent lights had their morning quality slightly cooler, slightly harsher than they'd be in an hour once the room warmed up from bodies and equipment. I could hear the intake crew through the wall, the low murmur of their conversation, the occasional thud of something being sorted. "You're not finding these." I turned the phrase over the same way I'd turned the envelope. There were 2 ways to read it, and they pointed in opposite directions. The first, a statement of fact. You're not the one finding these, they're being placed, delivered, aimed at you. You have no agency in this. The second, which was worse, a correction. Whatever you think you've been doing the early arrival, the intake room walkthrough, the photographs lined up on your kitchen table that's not finding. You haven't found anything yet. I didn't know which reading was right. I still don't, entirely. But I know which one felt true when I was sitting alone at that table. I opened the envelope. 1 photograph, same dimensions as the others, same glossy consumer stock. But this one wasn't taken inside the building. It was my street. Shot from a vehicle, probably the angle and the slight motion blur on the edges suggested a window, and there was a partial reflection in the lower right corner that could have been a dashboard. My apartment building was visible, the beige brick face of it, the 2 steps up to the entrance, the iron railing that had been painted over enough times that the texture of the paint showed where the previous colors had bled through. I'd spent enough time on those steps that I could have described every detail from memory. I didn't need to. I was in the photograph. Standing on the 2nd step, keys in hand, turned slightly away from the entrance, not leaving. The posture was wrong for leaving. I was facing in, arriving. The angle of the light suggested early morning or late afternoon, but not midday. The photograph was recent. I could tell because of my jacket, a dark green canvas jacket I'd bought 3 months ago, before this job, but after the inventory job ended. I'd owned it for less time than I'd worked at this facility. I put it flat on the table and looked at the ceiling. Someone had been outside my building with a camera and had mailed me the photograph through the system they apparently already had access to, which meant they knew where I worked, had a method for inserting items into our intake chain, and had now confirmed for me, deliberately, pointedly, that they also knew where I lived. I thought about calling the police. I built the conversation in my head. Someone is sending me photographs of myself at work and at home through the mail system where I work. And also a ceramic mug came back twice. Hearing it in my own head was not encouraging. Nothing that had happened was physically threatening. Nothing was legally unambiguous. A photograph of a person in a public space, outside their own building, I didn't know what statute that violated, if any. Probably some combination of harassment and stalking definitions, but the word probably was doing a lot of work there, and I didn't have the money or the energy for a process I couldn't predict. I also thought about talking to my supervisor, which I should have done weeks ago, and which I'd been avoiding for the reasons I already mentioned. But the 4 words on the back of the envelope had shifted something. The messages, and they were messages. I wasn't calling them anything else now, had escalated from anomaly to declaration. Someone wanted me to understand that the frame I'd been using was wrong. I wasn't stumbling across things. I was receiving things. I needed to understand what I was receiving before I handed it to someone else to interpret. That sounds like rationalization. Maybe it is. But I also think it was the right instinct. And here's why. The moment I brought this to the supervisor, it became an HR matter. An HR matter becomes documentation and interviews, and people deciding on my behalf what this was and what to do about it. And somewhere in that process, someone would make a decision that closed off options, close the intake logs, interview staff, maybe bring in an outside party. All of which might be correct, and might also permanently interrupt the only channel through which I was getting any information. I wasn't protecting myself by staying quiet. I was keeping the line open. I went through the rest of that shift without saying anything. I logged the new envelope, noted the contents as one photograph, noted the writing on the exterior. I used the clinical language of intake documentation, and I put it in the hold queue, and I went home. That night, I took all 4 items out of the receipt envelope and laid them on the kitchen table in the order I'd received them. The mug in my memory, and the photograph from the first envelope, and the second photograph, and the street photograph. A sequence. I'd been thinking of them as separate incidents connected by their strangeness. But they weren't. They were a progression. The first photograph showed me from behind, working, camera near the intake door. The second showed me from the other end of the room, still working, camera near the exit door, figure watching from the corridor. The street photograph showed me arriving at my building, shot from outside. Each one moved the camera closer to my face and further from my workplace. And between the second and third photograph, someone had written on the exterior of the envelope, "You're not finding these, not stop looking, not a threat, a correction." I thought about what you'd want someone to understand if you sent them that message. You'd want them to understand that the looking wasn't the point. That whatever they thought the task was tracing the packages, identifying the sender, finding the camera positions, that wasn't it. If not finding, then what? I went back to the mug. I'd been treating the mug as incidental, a random object inside an anomalous package. But it had come back. Of everything that had moved through this sequence, the mug was the only object that had reappeared. Everything else, the photographs, the envelopes, it had been singular. The mug had cycled. I'd processed it, shelved it, and it had returned addressed to me. Then I'd reshelved it, and it had disappeared again. I wrote down everything I could remember about the mug. white ceramic. Standard size, the kind that holds about 12 ounces. The screen-printed image of mountains, not a specific mountain range I recognized, just a generic stock landscape. The kind that print-on-demand sites use as a placeholder design when the customer doesn't upload a custom image. Which meant either the mug was a demonstration item that never had a custom design, or someone had ordered it deliberately with the default image. I looked up the most common white ceramic mugs sold by print-on-demand services. The shape and proportions matched about a dozen different product bases, all from different suppliers, all essentially identical. No way to narrow it from appearance alone. But the stock landscape. I found it on the third site I checked. It was a free-use stock photograph of the Rocky Mountains, specifically a section of trail in Colorado that the original photographer had tagged extensively, available for commercial and personal use, used as a default placeholder by at least 4 print-on-demand platforms. I wasn't sure what I'd expected that to tell me, that the mug was ordered from one of 4 possible platforms, by someone who either didn't customize it or customized it to look uncustomized. Not particularly useful. What I kept coming back to was the cycling. The mug had been sent without a resolvable address, had come to us, had been processed and shelved, had somehow left the shelf, acquired my name and a card, been reinserted into the intake chain, and arrived at my table. Then had been reshelved by me and had disappeared again with no log entry. The documentation gaps weren't errors. They were the method. Someone was using the gaps in our logging system the way you'd use a door something they could open and close without the opening and closing being recorded. Which meant they understood our logging system. Not just in a general way, but specifically. The exact points where documentation was required, and the exact points where items could move without triggering an entry. That was not knowledge you acquired from outside the facility. I sat with that conclusion for several minutes because it changed the character of everything. The person responsible for this worked in my building, or had worked there recently enough that their operational knowledge was still accurate. The staff on my shift, Terrence, who I'd trust with my apartment keys without hesitation, which is itself a conclusion I should probably examine. 2 women who worked the far table and whose names I knew, but who I'd barely spoken to beyond pleasantries. A guy named Dom, who called in sick roughly every other week and spent his actual working hours doing the minimum, and the intake staff, the dock crew, the backroom people, 12, maybe 15 people I saw regularly without knowing much about them. The supervisor was a woman named Karen, who managed 2 shifts and was efficient and impersonal in the way that good shift supervisors often are. She was rarely on the floor with us. She moved between the office, the intake area, and the back room according to a schedule she kept to herself. I thought about Karen. I thought about what she would and wouldn't know, about how items moved through the system. She'd know everything. I didn't let myself settle on that. It was too easy. And easy conclusions in situations like this are usually wrong. But I filed it. The following week was when the system changed. Up until then, everything had come through the mail inserted into the intake chain, processed normally, routed to me through the ordinary flow of work. The next item didn't come through the mail. It was at my workstation when I arrived, not on the cart, not staged in the intake area. It was sitting on the table surface directly in front of my chair, the chair I used every day. At the end of the table, I always worked. Not any other chair, not any other position. Placed there, waiting. A small notebook, the cheap kind, cardboard cover, the wire spiral binding along the top, about 4 inches by 6. The cover was plain blue. I didn't touch it immediately. I stood at the edge of my workstation and looked at it, then looked at the room. Terrence wasn't in yet. The two women were at the far table, talking to each other. Dom's station was empty, which was normal. I looked at the ceiling cameras, both domes pointing inward as always, capturing the table length. Whatever angle they used, my workstation was within frame. If someone had placed this notebook on my table during an off-hours access, it would be on camera. I sat down and opened the notebook. Most of the pages were blank, but the first 8 or 9 pages had been written on the same slow, careful handwriting as the card and the envelope. Not sentences, lists. The first page had dates going back almost 5 months, which was before I started this job. Some of the dates had times next to them. The times were irregular, not a schedule, more like a log. I recognized 2 of the dates immediately. The Tuesday or Wednesday I'd first processed the mug package. The day the padded envelope with the first photograph had come through. The dates went back further, to times before I was here. And then, on the 3rd page, I found the entries that stopped me. Names. 5 of them. First names only, like the card. Each one followed by a short notation, 2 or 3 words, abbreviated, that I couldn't immediately decode. I didn't recognize any of the names, except in the way that all ordinary first names are familiar. There was nothing to connect them to each other from the names alone, except for the dates next to each name. Each name had a date of first entry, and then a date with a different notation, a closing date, maybe, or a termination. And for 4 of the 5 names, those 2 dates were less than 3 months apart. The 5th name had an opening date, but no closing date. Below the 5th name, after a line of white space, was a 6th entry. No closing date. The opening date was 11 days before my first shift at this facility. The 6th name was mine. I closed the notebook, not because I'd stopped reading, because Terrence had just come through the door. He was unwrapping a breakfast sandwich, already talking about something, the baby's sleep schedule, a pediatrician appointment, something normal and continuous and entirely unconnected to the object under my left hand. I responded to enough of it to be credible. I don't remember what I said. He settled at his table, and I put the notebook in my jacket pocket, same pocket where I'd put the card with my name on it, and I started my shift. I processed 43 items that day. I know because I checked afterward. I remember almost none of them. What I was doing, while my hand scanned and logged and advanced, was working through the notebook structure. I'd had maybe 2 minutes with it before Terrence arrived, which was enough for the broad shape but not the detail. The dates log, 5 names plus mine, opening and closing entries. The 4 names with intervals under 3 months, the 1 name with no close, the 5th name with no closing date. I hadn't finished reading when I'd closed the cover. I didn't know what came after the names, and the notebook was in my pocket, and I couldn't look at it again until I was alone. That was the longest shift I've worked at that facility. Possibly the longest shift I've worked anywhere. I left at my normal time, sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes, and read the rest of the notebook. The pages after the names continued the same abbreviated notation style, but the content changed. Less like a log, more like instructions, or not instructions exactly, more like observations about procedure, specific procedural vulnerabilities. Which logging steps could be bypassed and how, which staff members worked, which sections on which days, when Karen was typically on the floor versus in the office, how long items could remain on the hold shelf before they were guaranteed to be audited. It was operational knowledge. The same operational knowledge I'd concluded the sender must have, written down with the same careful, slow handwriting, in the same notebook, on the pages immediately following my name. I sat with the obvious interpretation and tried to find the flaw in it. Someone had been inside this system, working in it, or adjacent to it for at least 5 months before I arrived. Had logged a sequence of other people, 5 of them, with names and dates. 4 had closed entries. 1 hadn't. Now I had an entry, and I didn't have a closing date yet. What did a closing date mean? I kept returning to that. The intervals under 3 months for 4 of them were too consistent for coincidence and too short for a standard employment cycle. If these were other workers, other people who'd cycled through this facility in positions like mine, 3 months was roughly the length of a probationary period. You could interpret it as, these people were here, and then they weren't. They left, or they were let go, or something else. The notation after each name was abbreviated enough that I couldn't decode it without more context. But the fifth name had been open for 7 months, based on the dates. I'd been here 14 months, I knew this, because I'd passed my 1-year mark, and Karen had sent a form email. 7 months was when the 5th person's opening date was, relative to now. Which meant if they were still here, they were still here now. I worked with 5 people on my regular shift. Terrence, the 2 women whose names I was now actively trying to remember, and realized I'd been mentally filing as background Dom, and occasionally a floater who came in when someone called sick. But there were other shifts, other staff, intake and dock and backroom people I saw without knowing. The 5th name in the notebook was Reyes. I didn't know anyone named Reyes. I thought about that carefully, went through every person I'd exchanged more than a sentence with in this building. Nobody. But I knew maybe a quarter of the staff well enough to know their names. The rest were faces and green zip-ups and dock boots. The last 2 pages of the notebook had something different. No dates, no names, just a paragraph, written in the same hand, but with less of the careful deliberateness. The letters were slightly more compressed, like it had been written faster or under different circumstances. I'm going to reproduce it as accurately as I can from memory, because I no longer have the notebook. I'll explain why later. It said roughly, the items are not the point. The items are to establish that the channel works in both directions. If you understand that, then you understand what to do next. The hold shelf, back section, date tab August. It has been there for 3 weeks. It belongs to you now. What you do with it determines whether you get a closing date or not. I read it 3 times in the car. Then I drove home and read it again at the kitchen table. The channel works in both directions. I'd been receiving. The implication was that I could send. I didn't sleep much. In the morning I went in early again, same pretext as before, and went to the hold shelf back section, August tab. There were 11 items staged under August, all within the date range the note described. I checked each one, not opening them, just reading the labels, looking for something that was meant for me or would be identifiable to me. The 9th item was a padded envelope with no label at all. No shipping, no return. Just a blank padded envelope, sealed. I took it. I brought it to the break room, which was empty at that hour, and opened it. Inside was a key. A standard cut door key. The kind a locksmith makes at a hardware kiosk. Brass, with a small loop of red rubber band around the bow. And a folded card, not the flower shop kind this time. Just a piece of paper folded in thirds. The paper said, loading dock side entrance. Tonight, 11 p.m. Come alone, which you will, because there's no one to bring. Leave the notebook on the intake counter when you leave your shift. It needs to go back into the system. I stood in the break room and read that second sentence again. Come alone, which you will because there's no one to bring. Accurate. Completely accurate. I'd had no one to call since the apartment got quieter, and the person writing this knew that not as a threat, the tone wasn't threatening, but as a plain statement of fact about my life that they had observed closely enough to state without softening it. That was the moment, I think, when the fear clarified. Not fear of what might happen at 11 p.m., something more specific. The fear of being known from the outside in, of someone having assembled an accurate picture of your life from observation while you were looking at packages. I left the notebook on the intake counter when my shift ended, the same way you'd leave a form to be processed. Just put it down and walked out. I went home. I ate something. I drove back at 10:40, parked on the street on the far side of the loading dock, and sat in the car for 15 minutes watching the building. Nothing moved. The dock lights were on their automatic setting on until midnight, which I knew because I'd stayed late once for a stock audit. The side entrance was a metal door set into the dock wall, painted the same brown as the cladding. I'd walked past it dozens of times without ever trying the handle. At 10:58, I crossed the lot and used the key. The door opened into a short corridor. I'd never been in this part of the building. Concrete floor, cinder block walls, a row of electrical panels on the left side. At the end of the corridor was another door, this one propped open with a folded square of cardboard. Through the propped door was the intake area. The dock lights came through the high windows along the dock wall, so the room wasn't fully dark. More like dim, the quality of light that makes distances unreliable. The receiving counters were clear. The carts were staged in their row along the opposite wall. Sitting on one of the receiving counters was a person, not standing. Sitting on the counter with their feet on a stool, posture relaxed, like someone who'd been waiting long enough to get comfortable. I registered height average and build slight and dark hair pulled back, and I registered that they were watching me cross the intake area toward them with the particular quality of attention you give something you've been watching for a long time and have now resolved into 3 dimensions. I stopped about 8 feet away. She said, "You took longer than the others." Her voice was quiet and completely even. Not a theatrical quietness, just someone who didn't need to raise their voice because the room was small and she had my full attention. I said, "The others from the notebook." "Yes." "What happened to the 4 with closing dates?" She looked at me for a moment. They stopped. 3 of them stopped responding to the items and submitted HR complaints. One of them understood the channel, but made a different decision than I'm hoping you'll make. She paused. "They're fine. They all still work here or transferred out. A closing date just means the sequence ended." And Reyes. Something shifted in her expression. Not much, but enough. "Reyes is why I need someone else." Her name was, she told me eventually, but not then. Then, she was just a person on a counter in a dim intake room, and she talked for a while in the careful, compressed way of someone who has rehearsed an explanation down to its minimum viable form. This is what she told me. She'd worked at the facility for 3 years. Before that, a similar facility in another region, different company. In her second year here, she'd noticed a pattern in the undeliverable items, not in the anomalous ones, like the photographs, but in the ordinary ones. A specific category of package that came through the system with consistent characteristics, unresolvable addresses, no return information, contents that were ordinary objects. Mugs, scarves, small framed prints, objects you'd give someone. The kind of thing that ships when someone wants to send a gift without being findable. She'd started flagging them, cross-referencing against regional routing data, comparing physical characteristics, trying to trace the common origin. Over about 8 months, she'd mapped a pattern that she described as a procurement channel, a method for moving small items through the undeliverable mail system in a way that reliably deposited them at specific regional facilities. Not randomly, targeted. She'd found the terminus of the channel, not a physical address. The packages never had those, but a consistent pattern of insertion. The items entered the system at a depot about 200 miles north of us, always on a Tuesday, always through the same intake classification. And from there, they routed, through a sequence of transfers she'd reconstructed, to our facility. She'd tried to trace the insertion point at the northern depot. She'd contacted their staff informally, built a relationship with a dock coordinator there, and the dock coordinator had identified the specific point of insertion, a particular contractor who serviced several facilities in the region, and used their access to place items directly into outgoing sort. The contractor's name was Reyes. She'd been building a documentation case, paper trail, physical evidence, a chain of custody that could withstand scrutiny if she brought it to the Postal Inspection Service, which was the correct authority. She needed a second person inside this facility to verify the receiving end, to formally document the pattern from the intake side, with records and testimony that would corroborate her Northern Depot evidence. She'd chosen 4 people before me, and the sequence had collapsed each time. She couldn't use Karen, who she believed knew about the irregular packages and had made an accommodation with that knowledge. She couldn't use the intake crew, who were too close to the vulnerability, and some of whom she didn't trust. She needed a processing staff member with documentation access and no existing entanglement with the irregular flow. She'd found me, done her assessment, and started the channel. I stood in the dim intake room and listened to all of this. And then I said, "The photographs, establishing that I could place things in your environment that the system wouldn't catch, including outside the facility." She said it without apology. "I needed you to understand the scope before I told you anything. You were outside my building. Once, I needed to verify the residential address independently." A brief pause. "I understand that's a significant line." It was. I didn't say anything for a moment. "What's in the packages?" I said. "The gifts, the mugs and scarves. Who are they for?" She looked at me with an expression I didn't fully understand until later. "That's the part I haven't been able to answer. The channel moves items to this facility specifically, not other facilities in the region, only here. And the items aren't undeliverable because the addresses are wrong. They're undeliverable because the recipients don't exist. The names on the internal packing cards, the ones you don't see because they're inside sealed packages, I've cross-referenced every one of them against every database I have access to. None of them correspond to living people." The dock lights hummed. Outside, somewhere on the road past the building, a truck downshifted through a long curve. "They're addressed to dead people," I said. "Or to people who don't exist yet," she said. "I haven't been able to determine which." I drove home that night thinking about the mug, not about Reyes, not about the channel, not about the names that didn't correspond to living people. The mug specifically. The white ceramic with the stock mountain landscape, the default placeholder image from a print-on-demand site. Someone had ordered it without customizing it, or had deliberately chosen the uncustomized version, and had addressed it to a name that didn't exist, and sent it north to be inserted into the system by a contractor who serviced regional mail facilities. A gift for nobody. That's what kept surfacing. The whole architecture of it, the careful insertion, the routing, the deposit at our facility in service of sending gifts to people who weren't there to receive them. I'd spent 14 months processing the ordinary detritus of human communication and need. Birthday presents and kitchen equipment and books. Things people sent each other because they wanted to close a distance. And somewhere at the other end of a 200-mile chain, someone was closing a distance that had no other end. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark apartment and thought about what she'd asked me to do, which was straightforward in its mechanics. Document the irregular items from the processing side. Maintain a formal log with physical evidence, chain of custody notes, timestamps. The same work I did every day, applied to a specific subset of items and preserved outside the facility's own documentation system. When she had enough from both ends, she'd go to the Postal Inspection Service with a complete package. The mechanics were straightforward. The question was whether I trusted her. I'd been the subject of a months-long surveillance operation conducted by a woman I'd met once in a dim room. She'd been outside my building. She'd been inside my workplace in ways that shouldn't have been possible. She'd assembled an accurate enough picture of my personal life to note, without cruelty, but also without softening, that I had nobody to bring. She'd done the same thing to at least 4 other people before me, and described their departures from the sequence in terms that were carefully neutral, in the way that careful neutrality sometimes is. And yet, the items in the system, the gifts moving through a channel toward recipients who didn't exist, that part of it didn't serve her documentation case. She'd mentioned it after everything else, almost as an afterthought, and the expression on her face when I'd asked about it was the first thing she hadn't controlled. Something between frustration and something older than frustration, like a question she'd been carrying long enough that it had changed shape. I decided I trusted that. Not her, exactly. That. I spent the next 6 weeks doing what she'd asked. It wasn't difficult in terms of the work itself. I was already good at the job. I had documentation instincts from the inventory years, how to create records that would hold up, how to note provenance without editorializing, how to build a chain that a third party could follow without needing me to narrate it. I logged every irregular item that came through with the specific profile she'd described. Unresolvable address, no return, ordinary gift-type contents, inserted on a Tuesday. I photographed labels before processing. I kept physical copies of intake records for flagged items in a folder I kept in my car. We met twice more in the intake room. Late, same arrangement. She reviewed what I had, added it to her end, and told me where things stood. The Northern Depot contact, the dock coordinator she'd cultivated, had confirmed 3 more insertion events by Reyes and had agreed to provide a formal statement. The documentation was close to sufficient. Another few weeks. I asked her in the second meeting what she thought was going to happen when this went to inspection, not procedurally. I understood the procedural answer. I mean what she thought would happen to the channel itself, whether it would stop. She said she didn't know. She said she'd stopped being certain about what she wanted to happen to the channel sometime around month 4 of her investigation, and that she hadn't resolved that uncertainty, and that she'd decided to proceed anyway, because the correct thing, and the thing she personally wanted, had separated far enough that she was going to have to act on one of them, and let the other one be. I understood that more than I wanted to. The correct thing, in my own situation, had separated from what I personally wanted in a specific way that I hadn't let myself look at directly until about week 4 of the documentation work, when the pattern of the items became clear enough that I couldn't avoid it anymore. The gifts in the channel weren't random. I'd been logging them closely enough to see it. The contents, the mugs, the small framed prints, the scarves, the occasional book weren't generic. They were specific in the way that gifts are specific when you know the recipient. The mug with the stock landscape, There was a region of Colorado that appeared in that stock photograph, a particular visible peak, and it was identifiable if you knew where to look. The book that came through in week 3 was a specific edition of a specific novel, the kind of edition you'd source deliberately, not the first copy that appeared in a search. The small framed print, a botanical illustration, the kind that gets sold in markets, was of a plant I recognized because I'd killed one on my windowsill the previous winter. A common enough plant. But still, I know how that sounds. I know that the human brain, under sustained uncertainty, will pattern match in any direction that feels meaningful. I spent a long time in inventory work, learning to distrust that instinct, to verify before concluding, to require more than resonance before I called something a connection. But the name on the packing card inside the mug packaged the inside card. The one I wasn't supposed to see because I'd opened a package that had already been opened was a name I recognized. A woman's name. A name I'd heard in an entirely different context, years earlier, in a conversation I'd had no reason to file, and every reason to have forgotten, and apparently hadn't. My mother mentioned her once, not in a significant way. A college friend she'd lost touch with after a move, someone who'd been important during a particular stretch of difficult years, and then simply wasn't in her life anymore. The way people weren't, before the internet made that kind of disappearance harder to sustain. She'd mentioned the name once, I'd heard it, and my brain had kept it the way brains keep things they're never asked to retrieve. I sat with the open package in the processing room and looked at the name on the card and thought about the stock photograph of the mountains and the particular visible peak and the specific edition of the specific novel. And I thought about a woman sending gifts through an untraceable channel to someone who no longer had a receiving address. I don't know if I'm right. I want to be honest about that. The connection I've described is circumstantial in every particular. The name could be shared by many people. The mountain could mean something else entirely. The book could have been a coincidence of taste. I cannot verify any of it, and I'm aware that I'm a person who has spent a significant portion of his life in a quiet apartment with too much space for certain kinds of thinking. But I didn't document those items the same way I documented the others. I logged them normally for the facility record contents, condition, disposition. What I didn't include in the folder in my car was any note about the name on the packing card, or the mountain, or the book. I left that part out. Deliberately, with full understanding of what I was doing. The correct thing would have been to include it. A complete documentation case includes everything. She'd asked me to be thorough. I chose not to be thorough about that part. I made that choice, and I've kept it. She submitted the package to the Postal Inspection Service in early spring. I don't know exactly when she told me after the fact, in a brief message left the same way the first items had been left, on my workstation. A folded note this time, with no performance around it. Just the information and a time to meet if I wanted an update. I met her. She looked tired in a different way than before she'd looked like someone running on compressed purpose. And now she looked like someone who'd put something down and hadn't yet figured out how to stand differently without it. The inspection service had opened a preliminary inquiry. Reyes had been identified and was under review. The Northern Depot coordinator had given his statement. The channel had gone quiet. No new insertions since the inquiry opened, which could mean Reyes had been tipped off, or had noticed the change in documentation patterns, or had simply stopped for reasons neither of us could know. She said she thought it was over, meaning the channel was probably finished, disrupted at the insertion point. The items currently in the system would work through, and then there wouldn't be new ones. I asked her if that was what she'd wanted. She said, "I wanted to know what it was. I still don't. Not entirely. But I stopped it." She looked at the receiving counter where she'd been sitting the first night. I think those are different things. I thought about the gifts still moving through the system toward recipients who weren't there, working their way through the last of their routing, arriving at our facility, being processed and logged and held, and eventually auctioned or donated. The mug sitting on a shelf somewhere. The book. I processed those last items in the weeks after the inquiry opened, and I logged them the way I logged everything. And when they hit the hold window, and nobody claimed them, they went the same way everything unclaimed goes. I still work there. That might be surprising. I thought about leaving. There was a point where I'd built the case for it in my head. The whole argument for why the facility had become a place I should move on from. But the argument kept collapsing under the weight of the alternative, which was another job search, another adjustment, another start. And the work itself hadn't changed. 40 to 100 items a day. Terrence talking about his kids, who are growing at a rate that seems impossible even from the outside. The fluorescent buzz when you think about it. Karen knows something. I still believe that. She's never acknowledged any of it, and I've never given her reason to think I'd raise it. And that arrangement sits between us with the particular weight of things that are true and unspoken. I don't know what she knows specifically, or why she accommodated it, or whether accommodation is even the right word. That's a door I've left closed. I'm aware it's still there. The woman I met in the intake room, I'm not going to use her name here, for reasons that I think are obvious and that she'd appreciate. She transferred to a different facility about 6 weeks after the inspection inquiry opened. We're not in contact. I think about her with something that isn't quite admiration and isn't quite pity, and might just be recognition. The feeling of having seen someone do a thing that cost them in a currency they'd been saving without knowing it. I think about the sender more than I think about Reyes or the channel or the procedural details. I think about whoever assembled those packages at the origin point of a 200-mile chain, whoever handled the same stock mountain image and the same careful print-on-demand interface, whoever knew a particular person well enough to choose a specific edition and a specific plant, and an address that used to be correct. There's a particular quality to that kind of persistence. The willingness to keep sending when you've already accepted that the sending is the whole of it. That receipt has become impossible, and you've made your peace with that, and you keep sending anyway. I don't know if my mother knows she was being sent things. I haven't asked. I'm not sure what the question would look like in an ordinary conversation, or whether there's a version of it that doesn't require me to explain how I know, which would require me to explain the last 14 months in a way I'm not ready to do. She mentioned that woman once, years ago. Maybe she's thought about her since, and maybe she hasn't. People hold losses in different configurations, and not all of them are visible from the outside. The last item in the channel that I processed was a scarf. Wool, dark red, folded and wrapped in tissue inside a small box with the usual profile. I logged it, held it, advanced it through the window. Before it went to auction, I unfolded it once, just to check for identifying information inside the fabric. There was a small tag, the handwritten kind that comes with artisan goods at markets. No maker's name, no price. Just a note in handwriting I didn't recognize, different from the careful, slow hand that had written my name on a card. Different from any handwriting in the notebook. Looser, quicker. The handwriting of someone who wrote often and without effort. It said, "For when it gets cold." That was it. No name, no address. For when it gets cold. I folded the scarf back along its creases and logged it and put it in the auction queue and went back to work. I still think about it when November comes around. I don't know why November specifically. Maybe just the weather turning and the quality of the light through the high dock windows, and the way the walk from the parking lot gets shorter when you're moving faster. Maybe just the cold.